So that's a rule-bound life. That's what, I mean, one marker that you get is that there are rules and there is an attempt to adhere to the rules. So that's one thing.
Rules or beliefs, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But no, they've been written down as rules. I mean, it's just not a set of beliefs. Because these, once you, and actually, these are rules which are drafted as a constitution to be drafted, right? And then you actually sign on it. So it's almost a legal document. And those who wish to live in this community, many of them actually sign those documents as one would sign a legal document, as one would sign a contract.
This is like definitely like a very peaceful place when you like compare it to the outside world. You know, like the city, it's like a lot of turmoil, like definitely the traffic, a lot of chaos, and like I think that kind of says something about who he was. He was such like a peaceful man in the midst of all this chaos and all this turmoil.
Do you know anything about the location of this place, in the sense of where, which part of? I mean, I know that you just visitors, but does it give you any sense of where it could have been located? Let's say in 1917 he came here, so it's almost 90 years ago, a little more than 90 years ago. Does that give you a sense of what this could have been like? Why would somebody choose a place like this? I mean, why come to the city of Ahmedabad, for example?
They said it was a city for weavers, and he wanted to start a movement for like homemade products. So he said that was like a good place to start.
Because we also heard because maybe Ahmedabad had a station, railway station, and it was easily accessible.
So it gives you a sense of a certain kind of craft tradition and certain kind of political economy within which he roots himself, and also a certain idea of politics. Because if you want to do politics in such a way that requires a railway station, it gives you a sense of where politics should be located in the early half of the 20th century. What else does it tell you? Does a river mean anything? Well, I know that there is no river anymore, but there was a river, a real one, with real water in it.
Was it like the city was, in those days, the city was on the other side of the river and he established an ashram this side of the river, and maybe because he was not so easily, then his ideologies were not accepted by the social norms of where he said, okay, untouchability will be accepted in this ashram and so on and so forth. So this, I can say, this might have been the outskirts of the city then.
Very insightful, very insightful.
No, we have heard these through many workshops that we have been going through.
What do you know of his early life? I mean, because he comes here as almost an old man, right? Old by standards of 1920s, where the life expectancy in India was 52. When he comes here, it's 47. Didn't really expect to live that long. Of course, he manages to pull on for another 20 years. That's another matter. But do we have any idea of what it meant? What did he do before he landed here?
Before coming over here, he actually went to South Africa. There was some sort of a racial injustice that was done, that he was not allowed to board a train in which only only the white South Africans were allowed. So from that idea, he thought that why is this sort of injustice being done towards me, and that's the idea where he started his whole movements towards satyagraha and stuff like that. And then on the later parts of this life, he thought that I should do something for my country, and then he moved back to India. And after looking at the condition of India under the British rule, he started his movement.
So something happened in South Africa. A long period of about 20 years that he spent in South Africa. It's a very long period of his life. In fact, if he lived anywhere struck roots, it was in South Africa and not here. So that's a different perspective that you begin to get on Gandhi when you look at the South Africa case. What was there before South Africa?
He did his education from England and then practiced something in Rajkot. Then he went to South Africa as an advisor in England.
Right. Okay. What would you like to know? I mean, I could tell you the story. I could speak about ideas. I could speak about movements. We could speak about all the quarrels that we have with him. We continue to have with him. Where would you? I mean, if there is a question that bothers you as a group or as an individual, what would that be?
I would like to know why was Gandhi successful?
Okay.
India is known like Gandhiji was not the only freedom fighter who worked. Like there were the likes of Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, many other. But what was so special about this guy that what made him known as the father of the nation? Okay, non-violence was the one thing that was not known till now to any parts of the world. So why only this guy has been on the like Indian rupee for so and so long, and what made him so special that the other likes of other heroes were sort of like neglected, you can say? Was it wasn't just a one man who changed the entire history of India. Yeah, it was like 150-year-old struggle that made India what it is after independence. So why give so much of an importance to one particular person to the fact that others are totally neglected?
Very, very fascinating. What else? Yeah.
I would like to know about his early life and what kind of like led him to this, because in America you really don't learn about him before India.
Is that it? Yeah.
I would also like to clear one doubt. Like in the movies, it is shown that Gandhiji had an option. Like when Bhagat Singh was going to be hanged, Gandhiji had an option to stop his hanging. But what he did, he signed the letter that was given to it, and he broke the pen. What was the main motive behind this? Like what could have been the reason why he did that? Was this political thinking that if Bhagat Singh did it, then if Bhagat Singh, this was like way in the 1930s, way before that. So did he thought Bhagat Singh was not?
This was 1929.
29, yeah. So did he think that if Bhagat Singh would have been a part of India, he would overpower or he would overshadow Gandhi?
I don't know how taboo this is, but in the States, there's kind of like a perception that Gandhi could do no wrong and like he was the ideal human being. But I was wondering if you could offer a more realistic perspective of Gandhi as a man rather than as a deified figure, because I mean it's almost impossible to believe that he had no vice or things of that nature. So I was just wondering if you could offer a perspective.
Sure.
Rita was just telling me about the role his wife played in his life, and I was wondering if you could talk some more about that.
So we want certain biographical details, certain perspective on Gandhi's early life and what it meant, if that was a preparation for something that happened in India. If there was an innovation that he brings about in the national movement and what that innovation is, and then perceptions about Gandhi's role in post-independent India. So we're looking at about 4 kinds of broad things. Just to clarify your doubt, that film is an entirely work of fiction. No such thing ever happened. We'll come to that. Okay? Gandhi was not given to breaking anything. The only thing that he probably broke was his fast occasionally, right? But no object. And of course Gandhi had absolutely no choice in the matter, but we'll come to that. Right? But the more important thing is to how do we locate Gandhi in the post-independent political, social, cultural discourse in India. So that's what we're looking at, 4 or 5 years. It's an unremarkable life, the first 15 or 18 years. He does almost everything that. Let's not forget that he's a 19th century person, born in 1869. So we're going to celebrate about 150 years of his birth in another 8 years. So it was a long, long time ago, but not so long ago. He was. We have his photographs, we have his voices. So in some ways, there is a distance. There is also some way a deep sense of proximity that's available. A lot of his responses are of a 19th century person. Do not expect Gandhi to be a 21st century university-going young individual. That's an unfair expectation to have of anyone who's not of our times. So therefore, any attempt to pull him into the contemporary times in toto would always fail, and it would be very frustrating. Born in 1869 to a family of administrators, somebody who understands politics very closely. His father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, 3 people, were prime ministers of important princely states. So somebody who grows up with politics around him. It's not an alien thing for him at all. He understands administration. He grows up understanding administration. He grows up understanding rules and regulations. And of course, the family's fortunes dip at some point. If you were to look at an Indian textbook on all of us have to subject it to some kind of lessons of Gandhi, and from early part, 2 things would stand out, or 3 things would stand out. 3 kinds of stories would be told. One, that he was very bad at spelling. He couldn't get the spelling of kettle right. So that's one thing which comes to us. The second thing that comes to us is that he liked to smoke. And since he didn't really have money, there was no idea of pocket money, he was given to stealing. The second thing that you get. And third, that like everybody else in the 19th century, his was no exception. It's a child marriage, at the age of 13. And grows up with deep anxieties about sexuality. His own sexuality and sexuality of others. These 3 things would come to you if you really look at the kind of Indian textbooks. What's remarkable about that is that it's an unusual family in many ways. Not about it being powerful, not about it being moneyed, but what you find is that it's a very eclectic family in terms of its religious influences. Now, even today, to find that kind of easy acceptance, easy movement between beliefs is something that you don't find. It's a particular kind of a Hindu family. It's a Vaishnava family, which would do largely some form of Krishna bhakti, worship of Krishna in some forms. At the same time, you realize that mother belongs to a very peculiar, very marginal sect. And it's a sect which combines actually elements of Islam, elements of Sikhism, elements of Hinduism. It's called the Pranami sect. It's not an idol worshipping sect. It actually worships a book. That's perhaps, along with Sikhism, the only Indic religion which has the prominence of the idea of the book. All forms of worship are Islamic. So he grows up in a family like that. Also, what you realize is that when he, in a Vaishnava family, it's the influence of a certain kind of retelling of Ram's story which becomes important. So he grows up in a family where the idea of religion is itself very open. It's not a closed, religiously closed family, which would be very unusual for any historian of social science or social history of the 19th century or even 20th century to tell you that it's something which does not happen very easily, that kind of movement. So that's one thing that we need to remember, and I think that would give him a certain kind of openness to the idea of religion and to various religious beliefs much later in his life. So that's one. The second thing that you realize is that there is a certain emphasis about not truth. There is a difference between being an emphasis on truth and emphasis on being truthfulness. Truthfulness is about conduct. It's about how you conduct yourself. What is it that you do? And the family, and if you were to read the biographies, or if you were to read the autobiography, for example, you realize that there is a premium placed on a certain kind of conduct where honesty, transparency, and a certain adherence to truthful behavior becomes crucial for that family. The third thing that you realize is that there is a desire to break free, and that desire comes to us in various ways. He wants to break free of the norms, he wants to break free of the social moorings, he wants to break free of the local politics that he is part of and something that they've helped share and helped shape. He also wants to break free of the kind of uneasy future that awaits him and takes a decision very, very remarkable for his period and his times to actually leave. Rita did at one point we both of us were part of sets of conversations about traveling.
Yeah.
Right? And then what it meant to travel in the 19th century, early 20th century, we're talking about late 19th century. Travel actually included a certain form of social opposition, certain kind of taboos about traveling, certainly crossing the seas. We know that when he traveled out or decided to travel out, the community placed a ban on it, saying you cannot because it's going to break certain forms of rules, and therefore he's excommunicated. And what is the England that he decides to go to England to study. There were only two professions in India, but there were only two professions available under colonial regimes, because modernity, as we understand it, is just beginning to enter large parts of the world. And what are these two professions? Two knowledge systems which come to India, which continue to dominate India even today. One is medicine and the other is law. These are the first two knowledge systems, if you're thinking of knowledge systems which begin to enter India. 19th century, if you wanted to be a rocket scientist, you either became a lawyer or you became a doctor. And to study law actually meant was to partake in the entire colonial project, because one aspect of colonial project was that you are going to, it's a rule-defined existence. You partake in that, not just you partake in that, but your participation in the entire legal process begins to justify the colonial existence. So he decides to, so anybody who was bright in the 19th century, late 19th century, had only two options. If you're very bright, you became a lawyer. If you're just not so bright, you became a doctor. So you realize that the entire Indian national movement is actually held together by a bunch of lawyers and at a later point some doctors who begin to play an important role. Everyone else, it's a peculiar kind of knowledge which comes to colonial societies, and that's the kind of society that India was becoming. He lands up in London. Strange town, even today, would have been much stranger in the 19th century. Cold, damp, grey, nothing to write home about, and decides to become a barrister. What does the idea of education in one of the Inns of Court actually would mean. Would be nothing, no instruction. You spent your time in the library for 3 years, wrote your term papers, attended the dinners, and at the end of 3 years, if you paid your fees and attended enough number of dinners, you actually came back with the certification you were called to the bar. What it does is that it tries to provide you with a very broad liberal education. So anyone who went there actually came back steeped into political theory, political philosophy of the European kind. You came back with a great deal of theology, because there are Christian roots to jurisprudence, and so you had to do theology. You came back well versed in certain kind of Roman history, because the law that you studied Roman law. So anyone who came back knew Latin. So did Gandhi. Any barrister would even today be expected to pass a primary exam in Latin. You would be expected to pass an exam in French, which he did. So you come back with some kind of classical training, completely useless in terms of its application. Being trained as a barrister gave you no guarantee that you knew law. What you knew was theory of law. And the law as it was practiced, and it was codified in India, and the law as it was taught in London, and continues to be taught in London, there is a wide gulf. Nobody taught you the Indian Penal Code. Nobody taught you the Indian Evidence Act. They give you a theory of evidence as derived from Roman jurisprudence. So it comes back trained in the mind of a certain kind of openness. But what comes to him clearly during those 3 years is that he begins to look at the marginal, what today would call the dissenting imaginations of Europe. What are these? One, a very powerful critique which begins to emerge through the Romantic period in British literature and British politics of Industrial Revolution itself. So a critique of industrialization is something that is becoming very, very fashionable, powerful in Europe at that point. That's one. Second, of course, this critique also took forms of alternative lifestyles. One of them, of course, was vegetarianism. Vegetarianism was an alternative lifestyle. Gandhi does not go there convinced of the merits of vegetarianism. He goes there actually as a deviant, although does not eat meat because it's a promise that is given to his mother that he's not going to consume meat. But he's gone through a period of meat eating in India. It's in Europe that he begins to look at a lot of the literature which was coming out in terms of vegetarianism. There was a man called Henry Salt. I don't know whether people don't read Henry Salt anymore. Henry Salt was one of the major critiques of the Industrial Revolution. And he's also somebody who begins to provide a theory of an alternative social groupings. And one of the societies that he found was the Vegetarian Society. So he becomes a member of the Vegetarian Society. He also looks at alternative formations of religion. Very importantly, he begins to read and interact with one of the earliest feminist thinkers, theologians, a woman called Anna Kingsford. I don't know whether you don't do religion, but if you were to do divinity studies, Anna Kingsford would be very important because she's the first one who begins to speak of Christ as actually reviving a lot of the medieval Christian practices and creating an entire theology around the figure of Christ as a caregiver. And therefore, and she also begins to speak of a certain mystical Christ, devoid of the church, outside of the church, almost a personal Christ. And she founded, along with her partner, boyfriend, I think sometime husband, a man called Edward Maitland. Two of them together actually found this thing called the esoteric Christian movement, which actually begins to look at the entire Christian theology very differently. Gandhi actually begins to participate in the discussions about Christian theology. On the other hand, you also have various other intellectual and philosophical societies being formed. One of the more important ones was called the Theosophical Society, which again provides a certain critique of religion, which also provides a certain, mystical explanation of the universe and one's location within it. So you get critique of industrialization, certain kind of romantic poetry and romantic imagination. You get vegetarianism, you get esoteric Christian influences. You get esoteric Christian influences, and you get a certain sense of European history, European politics, European thought practices. And it's with that he comes to India. Not that education does anything in terms of practical details. The autobiography we were to read will tell you that he had great hesitation in terms of actually becoming a lawyer. Nothing that he had done in Europe for 3 years gave him any sense of what it would actually mean when you begin to appear before a court of law in India. Unsuccessful, not really fitting in, wanting to reform both the family and the self. But what these three experiences in Europe, all the three, whether it is the Theosophical Society, whether it's the Esoteric Christian Union, or whether it's the vegetarian movement, it begins to speak of a certain idea that self, the person that you're talking about, is where all politics begins to emerge. So the idea that the self is crucial to any sense of politics begins to take shape in Gandhi. And it is not something that he is somebody who's, it's almost like a bricklayer putting together various influences and looking at saying each of these actually require a certain set of self-practices, certain kind of idea of the person to emerge, which is a different person from the one who's the traditional person who accepts certain kinds of social formation of the self. He wants to escape again, and like all good Gujaratis, if you want to escape, you run away abroad. Gujaratis are very good at running away abroad. Every time there is, something happens. And he goes to South Africa. He had absolutely no clue as to what South African society was. He had expected the South African society to be like the English society. He had expected the South African society to be as open as the European society that he had experienced both in London, as also his travels through Europe, as also in France. It's a very different sense that he had got of Europe. What he finds there is a very different kind of political economy. He finds very different set of rules and regulations, which later we began to call the apartheid regime, but its roots are in the 19th century. What is this apartheid regime constituted of? Certain kinds of racial discrimination, which we know. Certain kind of legal provision which provide, which put prohibitions on intermixing of races, which also divides your cityscape in terms of white and non-white, white and colored. So you get, but what you also get is a very different political economy. Anyone who knows the history of South Africa, or anyone who knows the history of colonial expansion, knows that these colonies play a very important role in creating the Industrial Revolution for England and for Europe. What happens? Slavery has been banned. It's been declared there's been prohibition on slavery. Where do you get labor from? You actually create a legal fiction. You create free slaves, and that slavery was called the indentured model. People like you and me would write out that for the next 3 years or 5 years we wish to be slaves, and you create an indentured system, and you were taken as migrant laborers to South Africa. Now the entire African agriculture, what is called the plantation economy of Africa, survives or becomes possible through this indentured labor, which begins if you look at the entire Asia Pacific, and if you look at why is it that all these small islands, something like Fiji, the Caribbeans, all of these places suddenly begin to acquire Indian population. That population comes through this process of indentured labor. That's one of the largest migration of labor which takes place in the 19th century. You're looking at something like 100,000 laborers being taken to only the colony of South Africa. But you're looking at much larger kind of movement of labor which begins to take place from 3 states or 4 states in India. Largely Eastern India and certain parts of Southern India. And the labor goes there. And it lives in what are called coolie locations. It lives in, they were all called Samis in the local parlance, or they were, and they were all housed in these coolie locations, which is like, if you know your history of slavery, you know what these slave locations would have been like. They are the ones who begin the cotton growing, as it would happen in America. They are the ones who begin sugarcane plantations. They are the ones who begin laying of the railway tracks. And so the entire expansion of the plantation economy in the Caribbean, in the Fijian Islands, and in East Africa and in South Africa happens through indentured labor. Anyone who went there as indentured was primarily poor, peasant, probably coming from the lowest strata of Indian social imagination as also the political economy. They would have been among the poorest of farmers or landless agricultural laborers. Many women were also taken because you need to service these men. And of course, I mean, if you know the history of how something like Australia was colonized and how the entire ships of women which went there, right? I mean, they were called the floating brothels. So you needed women. And so you get women, men, some of them going from the Malay islands, so they began to be called the Asiatics because they would have some Chinese origin. Right? So all of these actually begin to move to South Africa and East Africa. When Gandhi lands there, he is the only person of color who's and the entire, I mean, you know your African continent. It's a huge thing. Okay? He's the only person of color there who has higher education. He in fact not is the only barrister in the all of South Africa and East Africa and North Africa. So you can look at this entire huge continent, one character who knows law, who's person of color. So he's actually placed in a very, very different kind of situation. When he came to India, he was one of several. Not many, but several. The idea of law, the legal practice is something, and a rule-bound existence is already there. He goes to a completely white society where all laws are made for the white, and there is no legal interpreter that the black community of the people of color have. He's the first one, and he would remain the only one till about 1905. So the first 16 years of his life in South Africa, he would be the only barrister or only person of color with a law degree in the entire subcontinent or the entire continent of Africa. What does he find then? There. He gets thrown out of a train, which are unimportant details. What happens there, then he begins to look at that there is a different kind of a side to the entire colonial enterprise. Colonial enterprise in India was very benign. Still we have problems with it, but if you look at the kind of colonialism that goes to other parts of the world, Indian experience was very benign. Also much.
So because he was in this part part of Porbandar, right? Where
Yes.
if the visibility of the colonial enterprise will be much
which is non-existent.
lower.
Which is
So
non-existent.
if he
because-
was living in Kolkata, let's say, and was barred entry from a club, which would be an experience very similar to the one he goes through in South Africa,
Right.
it would have been
Very different. So Saurashtra, the part of Gujarat that he came from, was never under direct British rule. There was a two-tier political system. There was the native princes continued to rule, and there was a political agent which negotiated their own internal differences, but also their relations with the British in Delhi or in Bombay. So Gandhi begins to understand a very different colonial enterprise, different set of laws, but more importantly, a political economy of empire which is based on extraction. And if you see as to what is it that he's reading during those 15 years, of course, please get this thing out of your head that he did not read books. When he came back from South Africa, having disposed of his library and come only with what he thought were essential books, those essential books actually formed the first public library of Ahmedabad, with 10,600 books that he traveled with. If you look at, right, every time he went to prison, if it was for 3 years, he would come back having read 1,000 books or 2,000 books, made notes about them. Exceptionally well-read character. He continued to read in many European languages, as also about 10 Indian languages. Sometimes primary stuff, at a very basic kind of writing, sometimes very philosophical kind of writing. What is it that Gandhi begins to read? He begins to read a great deal of political economy in South Africa. He's looking at labor relations, he's looking at movement of labor, he's beginning to understand the plantation economy. He also begins to develop a philosophical critique of racialism coming from within the Christian tradition. So he wants to begin to speak to the colonial South Africa, because they all claim to be good Christians. So he says, what is it within Christianity that could actually begin to challenge this? So the first year itself that he was in South Africa, in Pretoria in fact, the list that we have, the list includes 200 books on theology. So actually, so that's what he's reading. Yeah? And therefore you begin to realize that the first people who begin to converse with Gandhi in South Africa are all Christian theologians. Gandhi's first biographer also was a priest, Reverend Joseph Dock. So you can begin to, so there's a deep conversation that begins with Christianity, which would last his entire life. So a certain critique of Christianity and a certain critique of racial segregation. Then you get a critique of political economy, which is based on plantation economy. Third, a certain understanding of how movement of labor was being carried out. And he would, through his life, begin to write reports on labor movements. Actual physical movement of labor. So if you really want to look at the entire history of migration of Indian laborers, indentured laborers from the, it's about 1830s when it begins, to about 1945, all that you need to look at are the journals that Gandhi published. They would invariably carry reports about movements of labor. So it's a critique of the entire idea of the empire which begins to get formed there. Also the notion that you needed to organize yourself politically if you had anything to do. So the first idea to organize yourself as a political grouping for him comes in South Africa. He establishes something which is called the Natal Indian Congress, which is a small body compared to what the body that it later became. It had in the initial membership of 2,500 individuals, all paid up members. Right? Each one had to pay a subscription to become part of that. But surprisingly, it worked much better than the Indian National Congress. Because the Indian National Congress would meet only once a year for 3 days in any city, pass certain resolutions or not pass certain resolutions, and the proceedings would be sent off to the British administration to either act upon them or not act upon them. But there was nothing that the Indian National Congress did which said we need to move in a certain direction. It is not an agitational party. It is not a party. It's a constitutional party. It believed in the entire act of petition, and they thought that petition itself was a form of public protest. Not only was a form of public protest, it was also an act of public education. So somebody like the early founders of the Indian National Congress wrote essays about how to write a petition. So, and how do you then begin to create people through the act of petitioning. South Africa, you get another thing. South Africa is also the time when he actually begins to look at the idea of violence and non-violence very seriously. And it is not an abstract notion that he's dealing with. He participates in two of the largest wars that take place in the South African continent, the Boer War. Gandhi is on the front, not with a machine gun in his hand, but as an ambulance corps bearer. He is actually stretcher bearer, because no white medical workers or healers would work with the Boers, because they were the ones who were fighting. And also the Zulu rebellion. In both instances, the Boer War and the Zulu rebellion, Gandhi actually is on the front. So he begins to understand what a war actually means, what a wounded body is, what a body in pain is. All his life, then therefore, he would start working on the idea of healing. And that idea of healing comes to him through the experiences on the war front. And these are very direct experiences, very intense experiences. He actually trained himself to be actually a trained compounder for 3 years. Every afternoon, having come back from the courts, he would go to Dr. Booth, who would teach him how to actually heal and tend a wounded body. So it's something that he acquires and acquires very, very specifically. Two important ideas begin to form in his head. One, that he realizes that newspapers or media are very crucial to any form of politics. Without access to media, you cannot do politics. Now, as an Indian in South Africa, he has no access to newspapers. So the best thing that he could do is to start his own. When he began, and that's something that would stay with him. From 1903 till 1948, there was not a day that he did not own a newspaper. He owned newspapers, he owned printing presses. He was the Times of India, simply put. The Indian opinion that he began printing there in South Africa came out in English, in Gujarati, in Hindi, on important issues in Urdu, and in Telugu, and in Tamil. So it's a 7-language newspaper that he ran. And that newspaper continued to run from 1903 to 1955, at which point the South African apartheid regime burnt down the entire edifice where the Indian opinion was being printed from. So it's a newspaper which continues. So the idea that you need to create a public opinion through certain access to media. So the idea that here is an old man, toothless, has no clue as to what the world of media is like. He's a media baron, simply put. Also this idea that he is a failed barrister, please get that out of your head. he was, right now we now know, we have two very, very fine historians working in the South African archives, on the legal archives. One, in fact, a professor of law from Virginia, who's been working on the South African archives, on the legal archives, on specifically Gandhi. And another Indian historian, a man called Ramchandra Guha. Both are looking at the legal archives of South Africa to understand what this meant. What it meant was that Gandhi was both an exceptionally successful barrister, not only in terms of a pro bono advocate looking at only the problems of the Indian community, exceptionally wealthy barrister. When he went to South Africa, his per annum salary was £105. £105 was attractive money per annum for an England-trained Indian barrister. By 1904, when he is beginning to give up his practice, he filed the last income tax, or with the last set of financial documents that we have of 1904, 1905, show his personal income after expenses of running a very large office in Johannesburg at £7,500. Recently, last week or last month, one of Gandhi's homes in South Africa went for a sale. It's still called the Beechcroft Villa. But if you look at the location of that villa, it's on the beach, that's all right. But on that street, one end of the street is the Prime Minister's house, and Gandhi's neighbor was the Attorney General of South Africa. So he is very much part of the new elite which has begun to emerge, both in terms of money and in terms of the influence that he has. You don't, in a segregated society, you don't go and buy a home on the same street as the Prime Minister. I would like to do that in Delhi, but I can't. That's not available. Money can't buy these things anymore, and did not buy those things even in those days. So he, at one level, he becomes a very important public figure in the history, in the politics and society of certain kind of South Africa which has begun to emerge. So you get the newspaper. The second thing that he begins to look at is also an idea of Indian community which is not divided in terms of linguistic provinces, is not divided in terms of religious divisions, and is also not divided on caste lines. One, because all of these are migrants, and their identity primarily is that of a migrant community of an indentured variety or as trading communities, but they are not segregated. So he gets to work with an Indian community which is far more cohesive than what he would find when he were to land in India, where he would find all those divisions staring back in his face. So a certain notion of Indian community that he finds cohesive to work with. And third, he begins to look at he begins to ask himself, what makes politics possible? How, what gives you a ground to enter politics? One, that you are on the margins. Two, almost every member of the people of your constituency is an indentured laborer, is a coolie. So what kind of politics do you do? Three, what would move the traders? Traders, as you know, are the most difficult people to get involved in the politics. The trading community actually looks for a certain kind of non-political existence. It's a certain kind of accommodative existence that trading community looks at, because they think that politics is bad for trade. And we're looking at both very petty shopkeepers plus very large traders and merchants. So what kind of politics do you do, and what allows for politics to be possible? One of the ideas that he came up with was that you require a community. Without a community, you cannot do politics. What does a community do? Community actually makes possible for some people to be full-time engaged in the act of politics. while others provide for their families. So if tomorrow I wanted to go to jail, for example, if my politics required that I go to prison, the moment I go to prison, my university will have to, by law, suspend my tenure. It would stop paying me a salary. The imprisonment could last from 3 years to 6 years. What happens to my family? Is there a mechanism, is there a logistics which allow for politics to be possible? And that the problem that Gandhi has is that nothing so far in South Africa or nothing in India has actually made possible for creating the material basis for certain kind of agitational politics to be possible. And so therefore he began to create a community like this. In South Africa at Phoenix, he went ahead and bought a huge piece of land, not huge, but the first one was a small piece of land which was about 100 acres. The second piece of land that he acquired was much larger, which was 1100 acres. 1100 acres by any stretch of imagination is a very large piece of land to set up a political community. The first one, which was called the Phoenix, was 100 acres. And the idea was that this community would actually begin to train people in politics. Now, how do you begin to train people in politics? What does training in politics require? Now, this is a problem that every political party has, or every political formation has. If you're going to create full-time political workers, one, you have to provide food. You give them food, you give them money, you've got to put their kids through school, you've got to look after the families. That requires money. That's one. Two, but what kind of training do they require? What kind of training of the body and the mind does politics of a certain anti-colonial variety actually entail? We're not talking about decent politics that you and I actually live in. We're looking at each one whose existence is very precarious because each one of them is a migrant. Each one there is not a full citizen, has no citizenship rights, has no civil rights, has no legal rights, or has legal rights which are very, very restricted. An imprisonment would actually mean a loss of livelihood. You're also looking at a situation where anyone playing a role in public life is by necessity and by definition is male. So you're looking at only politics of a certain kind. It had no place for women. Absolutely none. So if you look at the records of the first set of public meetings that Gandhi began to organize, there was not a single woman present. And it would be a huge struggle for him and for the Indian national movement later to create a public space which is sensitive to the needs of women and what women could do in terms of political participation. So began to create a community. Now what does that community actually do? First thing that Gandhi realized that none of us are actually prepared to be a prisoner. Now, I don't know whether you've ever been to a prison. Have you? Not even for tourism. No. I don't hope that you have. You've been there. Now, prison is not a picnic. One thing it's not a picnic. Two, South African prisons were continue to be much worse prisons than anywhere else in the world. I think what could compare with the South African prisons would be some East European prisons and some Russian prisons, but nothing in the civilized world ever came close to the South African prisons in terms of the kind of oppressive presence of the state apparatus which is there. When Gandhi went to the prison for the first time, it shattered him. Nothing had prepared him for the prison. Nothing, no political conviction, nothing had actually prepared him for the life in prison. He came out and said, if I'm going to ask people to be prisoners, because politics of an agitational kind would necessarily involve prison going, How do I train people? Or how do people train themselves? It requires a certain bodily training, but it also requires a certain mental training. Nothing in the prison should actually build you. If it begins to do that, you want to make a compromise and come out. Two, while you are in prison, the prisoner, the political prisoner, has to have the confidence that the community is going to look after the family, if there is a family to be looked after. Now, the ideal situation would be that anybody who participates in politics has no family. And Gandhi would strive to reach that kind of situation, that each one who participates in politics, or the ideal community of participants in politics, is an ascetic community. It's completely bereft of any family obligations. Now, this is not only Gandhi. You have to realize that even in the 19th century, in India, the first political novel that begins to be written by the first graduate of our university system, a man called Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the novel is called Anand Mat, actually begins to imagine a community of ascetics leading the movement for freedom. And this ascetic idea of an ascetic community, primarily ascetic community, plays a very important role in Indian politics even today. Somebody who's unattached, somebody who does not have a family, somebody who leads a sparse life, right? Both in terms of the left movement in India and also on the extreme right. So the entire spectrum, from the left to the right, you have the idea of asceticism within the Indian politics, which is very much part of it. So what's happening in India today, and which is supposedly being led by another ascetic figure, has resonance going back to the 19th century.
So that makes a lot of sense out of Gandhi's time, but like today, isn't there also an advantage to having politicians who have family, because they kind of have that connection a little more of having been a parent or something, or having to send kids through school and seeing those things? Isn't there also an advantage to having politicians who...
So almost all our politicians are like that, right? But when you have to begin to imagine a political formation, in our imagination, the role of the ascetic community is very important. So, there are these professional politicians, but behind them are the ideologues who are actually thinking. Now, every ideologue, whether on the left or the right, has to adhere to a certain ascetic form. Okay? So, while you have elected representatives who people like me and you, who are steeped in life as we live it, but behind them are these group of people who are experimenting on themselves in terms of a certain kind of ascetic life. Right? And the new work that has begun to emerge on, let's say, 1920s and 1930s left movements, extreme left movements, or even left movements, the entire idea of the communist movement in India, or the self-practices of those, of the communist members, were very akin to Gandhi's practices. So actually there is not because there is a spectrum which actually ties them in terms of the self-practices.
I'm sort of wondering why Katya is saying that, and I think there is a when you look at the US and you look at how presidential candidates will
foreground the family.
Foreground the family, beaming with the family, this happy family and what have you, and I have a feeling perhaps difference lies, I could be wrong, that we however unjustifiably, but we think of those who devote their life to politics. We see it as service. The language that is employed for such a career is that of service, of submitting yourself to a public life. And therefore the idea is that you do it as an individual or something. It's
or a member of a community which thinks alike. Right? And that my asceticism is therefore something which is supplanted by and strengthened by his asceticism.
So if you actually write, if you were to become a member of any of these organized political parties, as a card-carrying member, as we call, one of the things that we would be expected, right, is to adhere to a certain aesthetic norm. And today, right, on the right, the RSS and the BHP on one hand, and the extreme left, again, has and new work that's begun to come out on the communes in India, right? The political communes in India. It tells you that in terms of their daily life, the life in this place and life in that commune in Calcutta, there was hardly any difference in terms of the materiality, their self-practices. Now, the motivations were different, the forms were different, the rituals were different, but in terms of the material existence, it's almost on par that you get. So therefore the idea of community, and you need to create professionally trained political workers. And therefore a community like this, first one which is done in South Africa, becomes very crucial, because it's there that he began to train people in the craft of politics and the art of politics, and also the idea of being in service of people. What would it entail? It would entail actually keeping the prison timetable. Gandhi began to change his entire body as one, there's enough work now on the imprisoned body, which you would all read. Right? And what does that do to you? Now, so Gandhi actually begins to look at the timetable of the body and the day as if he were a prisoner. So you get up at 4:20 in the morning, and you begin your day at 4:20, not at 8 o'clock or 6:30 as he would have liked. So you begin at the crack of dawn, and you work your timetable around that till dusk, where all activity must cease and everyone must go into the cells. So the Phoenix settlement actually began to model itself in terms of its orientation to create the life of a prisoner. What would it entail? Every prisoner in South Africa was given something which is called millipede. I don't know whether it's something that none of us eat. Right? It's a kind of a corn broth. Right? If you're a vegetarian, there might be a few leaves of cabbage floating in it. Otherwise, there would be pieces of meat. If you're lucky, you would find it. But 3 meals: breakfast, your lunch, and your dinner is millipede. South African prisoners only got millipede to eat, which required you to have control over your tongue. It was called the control of palate. Now, if you're going to be there for 3 years, suddenly you can't order pizza. That's not possible. You've got to eat that. Or you were not allowed to cook your meals. So the idea that I would become, I would carry my kitchenette with me and I would, cultivate a prison garden, and that's not something which is available. Whether you were there for 6 months or 3 years, all your meals were millipede. And Gandhi realized that he couldn't eat it beyond. After the first week, he found the food repulsive. Now, it clearly is a problem that at one level your mind says you need to be a political prisoner, your body is not ready. So the South African experiment actually, so the idea of food becomes very central to Gandhi's political imagination. Because one, that it could be tasteless. 2, you ate what you got and you were grateful that you got some meal. 3, you couldn't ask for anything. What was served to you was served to you. If it came to you in a bowl, plump, and that's what you ate. Now, the Phoenix settlement actually begins to model itself in terms of food practices. A lot of people begin to experiment on the idea of food. Now here, therefore, a lot of writings of Gandhi, you realize, are around the control of the palate. And Gandhi's food practices become legendary. It all starts with being a prisoner. All his life he would continue to eat out of a bowl. So even if you gave him 5 kinds of things, They would all go into one bowl, and he would shovel it in. Not he wouldn't shovel it in with a wooden fork. A wooden bowl and a wooden fork is what he carried with him always, and all his meals were in that. All 3 meals. So, South African experiment actually prepares for him to come here. He leads 3 movements in South Africa. One on certain kind of new law, which was called the Black Law, which had come, which was going to strengthen segregation. So that's one. Second one, which also restricted trading rights of the Indian community. And third, which imposed a certain kind of penal tax on all members of the Asiatic community. So 3 movements around 3 different issues. It's also at that time that he began to lead deputations to England. So he's the only Indian leader actually who began to talk to the colonial regime. And that kind of negotiations would continue till the end of his life. But no Indian leader had actually carried a delegation of maybe 2 people or 3 people, stayed in London for 4 months, met every member of parliament that you could meet, met the Under Secretary for Colony, met the Secretary for Colony, actually made representations to the Prime Minister and to the Crown. So he goes through the South African experience gives him the understanding of dealing with the empire in terms of both the political structure as also the administrative structure. And on one of those 9/11 moments, it was 9/11, 1906, that he says, Satyagraha as we understand it today was invented. How does that happen? It happens almost by accident. They are in this large public meeting. The only people who would give them this public space were the Jews. So it's a Jewish theatre, the Empire Theatre in Johannesburg. This meeting is called All Men to Oppose a Certain Law. And one of them actually gets up and says, I'm not going to submit to this law and God is my witness. Now, the idea of invoking God into a political thing and saying, I would not submit it to it. Gandhi began to work that idea and said, what would it involve? It will involve self-suffering. It will involve being what we today call prisoners of conscience. But it would primarily involve developing a certain method which would be non-violent, would be based on the idea that the other person that you're dealing with is capable of recognizing your pain, and therefore capable of recognizing truth, whether the stated position is that of recognition or not, but you could actually begin to have a dialogue about truth. So it's always involved a certain dialogic framework. It always involved a certain sets of conversations. Sometimes about very fundamental issues, sometimes about the mechanics of that. So the method gets invented. It's also in South Africa that he has his first experience of leading or being, he was not the leader, but being part of a movement where women participated. And that's where his wife Kastur played a very important role, not just she, but also members of their other members of the community, and some other 11 women. There was a new law, there was a new Supreme Court judgment which said that all marriages, a marriage is a marriage only if it's a Christian marriage. Which meant that all these marriages, Indian marriages, and all the Asiatic marriages, anybody who underwent a marriage ritual which is not according to the Christian rite was nullified. Which meant that nobody could bring in a spouse to the colony. It's at that point that women began to participate in the political movement. Now, the question was, should or could women be prisoners? Were they trained to be prisoners? What happens? The first batch of political prisoners are led by his wife, Kasturi. Also, what you need to realize is that, and it's at that point that Gandhi began to look at the possibility of creating a mass movement where women would play an equally important role. But that was easier said than done. Kasturi was already in her 40s. Right? She could go. But there were a lot of the other women who were. There was a woman who was pregnant. There was a woman who had a baby that she was feeding at her breast. Now, what happens to all these people? Should they go in with the child? Should the pregnant women not participate in it? So Gandhi's conversations with women about politics actually begin in South Africa, and they would continue throughout his life. And they would be on about their bodily practices, about the behavior of their bodies, about violation of the body that would invariably happen in the prison. Okay? So the ashram actually also begins to create the possibility, or the space actually begins to create the possibility of women's participation in political processes. Right? So the idea of creating a political community, the idea of creating political public spaces where men and women could participate, maybe initially play different kinds of roles, right? But increasingly assume gender neutral roles, is something that Gandhi actually begins to work at the level of the mass movement. Right? Now, at the level of the individual and at the level of certain kind of social groupings, it did exist. Not in South Africa, in India it did exist. We look at the kind of movements which happened in Bengal in 1900, around what was called the partition of Bengal. You have certain possibilities of women's participation. But at the level of mass movement, it is Gandhi who actually began creating the possibility, along with his family, of women's politics. And now, when histories are now being written and they're looking at the documents, you begin to realize as to how these forms had to be invented. For example, a simple thing. One problem that Gandhi had, and not just Gandhi had, but any political leader working on women's issues would have, is to what do you do with the menstruating body? And in a society in 19th century, early 20th century, which had all sets of prohibitions and taboos about menstruating women, and a certain kind of prison system which was not geared to looking at these questions. So Gandhi, one of the things that happened here is that they actually begin to converse about sanitary napkins, as we come to understand it today. Gandhi would actually sit with them and see how they could be designed. Because suddenly 8,000 women are going to prison. You could not have said, no, only postmenopausal women go and participate in politics. Young women are going there. What do you do?
It's your birthday today. I just remembered. Many happy returns. I'm so sorry.
That happens. It's a good way to begin my evening.
Please wish him.
Happy birthday, sir.
Happy birthday.
Treat.
So you begin to have a certain. So Gandhi actually begins to talk to Kasturba about all these fundamental issues, right? And therefore the idea that later India would begin to say, here is somebody who actually formed the Indian community as we speak of it, in the political sense, not necessarily in the social sense. The political community of India begins to get formed around Gandhi and the sets of conversations that he would have with a series of people. You also have to realize that no other mass movement in India actually created public spaces for participation of women. No other mass movement. But also primarily because it's a primarily unarmed movement. So the public space is a non-threatening space that at least within the movement you begin to create a non-threatening space. You begin to create a non-violent space. Also because on a great emphasis on the probity of the individual, the public space becomes desexualized in many ways. So the sexual charge is taken out of those spaces. So a lot of young women, college-going kids, would actually find it possible for themselves to be part of the public movement or part of a procession and not fear molestation. So something begins to happen in South Africa. Now the problem really is that the other thing that he learns in custody is that you could be demanding in a prison. Gandhi had been a very docile prisoner till that point. Now this woman, people say she was unlettered, all of that. She went to prison and said,